Hi, so my name is Liberty. I am a recent graduate from the University of Manchester where I studied geography. I did a dissertation as part of that in my final year where I looked at microplastic pollution. Um, and since then, there's been some really exciting comms that have arisen from that dissertation. So I've been working on those. And I'm starting a new job later this month, working for RPS, which I'm really excited about. And I'm sure I'll bring up that later.
Perfect. Cheers, Liberty. I'm Alex. I work at Matter and I work with different fashion brands and textile companies and factories in the textile space, really trying to understand their goals with microplastic and microfiber reduction, where they are on their journey, what challenges they might be facing as businesses in reaching those goals, and really just try and understand how Matter's microfiber filtration units and sort of strategy alignment pieces might be able to help those businesses to reach their goals and overcome some tricky challenges along the way. So it's great to get the opportunity to sit down with Liberty and talk about some of her research and what she's been doing in her degree, because it's got a lot of publicity. Maybe as a starting point, Liberty, could you tell us a little bit more about the research you did on microplastics in the Medina River estuary and how you ended up looking at microplastics in your research and what was the kind of inspiration, I suppose?
So I'm a big kind of environmentalist. I'm really passionate about protecting and preserving the environment. So I knew that I wanted to do a dissertation focused on plastic pollution in particular. I was quite unaware of microplastics, to be honest, throughout kind of most of my education until my university degree, where my supervisor of my dissertation had actually done a lot of work looking at microplastics from wastewater discharge. So these are the particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters. So they're really tiny and we can't see them with our naked eye. I spent a lot of my dissertation with a microscope in front of me and a lovely lab coat and goggles on. So yeah, so I chose to look at an estuary on the Isle of Wight. So an estuary being that body of water in between the tidal body, so the coastal area. So that was the Solent between the Isle of Wight and Portsmouth and Southampton. And then the freshwater system, so the River Medina on the Isle of Wight, which then flows out into the Solent. I chose to focus on this because there's not been much kind of research concerning microplastics into estuaries. So most of the research of microplastics has been on these higher energy environments. So for example, rivers and coastal systems, oceans in particular, that's where kind of the research of microplastics has focused on. So I wanted to kind of pick a gap in this research and focus on a body of water that has not been studied much in the kind of fate of microplastics. So I chose the Medina Estuary. It's on the Isle of Wight. It's affected by wastewater discharge through two combined sewer overflows. So that's the point at which the wastewater is released into the aquatic environment. So I thought I'd kind of investigate this further and see how big of a source that wastewater system was of microplastics into the estuary.
I think it's really interesting sort of place to start with your research, and especially in the UK, sewer overflows, water treatment has become a much hotter topic over the last couple of years, and there's a lot of spotlight on it now. There's a lot of public awareness on the topic of how water is treated. In your research, what were some of the sort of surprising findings that you came across, especially when you're thinking about the actual sources of microplastics and where they're coming from and originating as well?
So just to kind of give a quick introduction on my methods. So I was sampling the intertidal mudflats of the estuary. So these are the mudflats, so the sediment which is exposed at low tide in an estuary. These are actually quite important for microplastics because of the lower energy nature. Similar to how sediment accumulates either side of the estuary, the microplastics and other pollutants are thought to do the same. So my sampling focused on that top 2 centimetres of the intertidal mudflats, which is thought to be the zone of deposition. I then did a lot of lab analysis at the University of Manchester, so density separation, filtration and removal of organic matter to kind of get my samples more pure. And then it was a lot of time under that microscope. But kind of I think the most surprising finding was that actually the the majority of the microplastics that I was identifying were primary microplastics. These primary microplastics are the microplastics which are designed to be less than 5 millimeters. So those are things like microfibers and microbeads. The alternative being secondary microplastics. So those are the microplastics which evolve through gradual fragmentation. So this is like those large litter items that end up in the environment, then kind of get broken down and end up in these secondary microplastics over a long period of time. It was very rare that I found secondary microplastics in my research, and the most dominant being microfibers. All the microplastics I found, 99% were microfibers. They occurred at all 16 sites, and basically dominated that microplastic assemblage. So I only actually identified microbeads and fragments at one site. And even at that one site, they made up a very small kind of proportion of that microplastic assemblage. So microfibers were the real key kind of finding of my research. I was just shocked at how much they just dominated the whole estuary in such kind of large kind of immense quantities. The median value of the kind of average value of microplastics across the estuary was 2,147 items per kilogram of sediment, and that sediment being dry. But the range was really significant. So the smallest kind of microplastic concentration at one site was 277 items per kilogram of sediment, and the largest being an estimate of more than 130,000 items per kilogram of sediment at one site, which is just, completely shocking when you convert that to per gram of sediment. That's more than 130 items per gram, and a significant proportion of that being made up of just microfibers. My findings were absolutely shocking, and I just didn't expect such high levels of microfibers across the whole estuary.
Yeah, it's really scary. I think you made a distinction there that a lot of people aren't aware of, in the public at least, and that's between microplastics and microfibers. And microplastics get a lot of press coverage. They get talked about a lot in different news outlets and on sustainability forums and conferences, but a lot of the time we find in the fashion sector that actually microfibers is the topic of conversation. Plastics are really bad, but fibers encompasses more than just plastic fragments, and it encompasses things like cotton and wool and other, natural fibers. So you mentioned microfibers and the sheer number of them that you found in different areas of sediment within the basin. Could you explain maybe why microfibers were so prevalent and why they are managing to get into the estuary and they're not being filtered out at an earlier point? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, so I kind of concluded from my findings that the dominance of primary microplastics, and specifically microfibers, was linked to the wastewater system as a source of these pollutants into the estuary. So going back to those two combined sewer overflows, they have really high annual spill rates. The event duration monitoring data by the Environment Agency just kind of proves how frequently those CSOs spill wastewater into the estuary. So it's clear that there's a link between the kind of prevalence and immense quantity of these microfibers and the wastewater system, and this discharge of wastewater into the estuary kind of on a frequent basis. There's also kind of some research that indicates that this wastewater treatment that occurs is ineffective at removing these microplastics and microfibers from that effluent, which is why we're getting such immense quantities of microfibers entering aquatic environments. And I think kind of one of the main sources of these microfibers into the wastewater system originally is laundering, so shedding fibers, shedding from clothes. That's that first point in that kind of journey where they enter the wastewater system through that laundering process. They're then released into the wastewater system. So there's already an issue here very early on in this stage, before that discharge even occurs into aquatic environments. It's kind of a really long process. But that also, that's also exciting. There's multiple kind of opportunities to then tackle this issue at different stages along kind of that chain, that process.
It can be a bit of an eye opener just how much fiber does come off clothes when we wash it, and then we hope that goes into a water system and gets treated and gets removed from the water, and that we get clean water out the end of the process. And that's obviously the goal of our water networks and water treatment in general. But there are holes in the network in places. There are different types of technologies with different levels of effectiveness out there, and so evidently some of this microfiber, a fairly large amount of microfiber, is ending up in estuaries like the Medina River estuary, and we see this in other environments around the world as well, with different textiles producers that we work with to try and reduce microfibers. I think it'd be interesting for everybody if you could talk a little bit about what the environmental impacts of things like microfibers and microplastics ending up in the natural environment actually is.
Yeah, of course. So another thing about the Medina Estuary is that it is a triple SI, so it's a site of special scientific interest. Those mudflats especially as well are really important breeding and feeding grounds for a kind of diverse range of wildlife. And even when I was conducting my research back in summer of 2023, it was really beautiful to see kind of all these like wading birds kind of inhabiting these mudflats. But then obviously you see the findings and it becomes kind of really alarming. Microfibers enter the food chain at the lowest level, and that's kind of by absorption into algae or ingestion by these like smaller organisms that kind of inhabit those mudflats. So they enter at the very lowest level, and then it's these kind of lower level species that act as these vectors, and then transport these microplastics kind of up to higher levels of the food chain, and which is why now these microfibers have been identified in kind of digestive systems of even large mammals, because despite their entry at lower levels of the food chain, they're able to kind of traverse up to higher levels. And even obviously now there's a lot of research emerging about identification of microfibers and other microplastics in breast milk and placenta, and other kind of human organs. So that's really alarming. We don't think about them kind of entering at that lower level as a huge risk until we kind of understand that they are able to kind of traverse up the food chain, and pose risks to even like these larger mammals and humans. In 2 occasions at 2 sites, I identified these clumps of microfibers, and these were kind of formed by an entanglement of an immense quantity of microfibers, which have kind of bundled together to form these larger clumps. And I think this is a real like big kind of threat of microfibers, specifically, is that ability to entangle together and form these kind of larger clumps, because kind of these can act in the same way as larger items in obstructing kind of the digestive passage, as well as resembling kind of food being that larger item, and kind of impacting on ingestion for some aquatic species. So I think this was another kind of alarming finding, and also proved really challenging to quantify, because there was such an immense quantity of microfibers kind of entangled in this clump. So that was kind of a challenge of my research, was how do we go about quantifying this immense this quantity of microfibers.
And maybe just dig into that a little bit more, like how did you go about quantifying that, and how did you kind of portray that in your research? Because that sounds like a really big issue. Small microfibers, people might not be able to see them or really like be aware of them, but when they group together into a larger body, that can cause different problems.
Of course, yeah. So I did have to kind of come up with a solution to this. How do I quantify this bundle of fibres, which were at such an immense quantity? So I used the hot needle test to confirm the identity of microplastics during my kind of lab work. So I had to use this to then kind of identify a proportion. So I would kind of extract a proportion from this bundle, and use the hot needle test to see whether these microfibers would react in the same way. So they respond to the hot needle test by melting or curling. And that confirms the presence of plastic because that heat disrupts those polymer chains. So the fibers that I extracted from this bundle all reacted in the same way. In addition, they were all kind of took the same homogeneously like color and kind of shaped appearance. So I was then able to confirm that all these fibers that were in this bundle were microfibers.
Sorry, going back a little bit there, you were able to confirm that the fibers within the bundle were plastic-based microfibers, rather than sort of natural fibers. Is that right?
Yeah, so just going back to that as well. So then I actually used graph paper to help me quantify these bundles. So under a microscope, I counted how many microfibers would occupy one single square of graph paper, and then extrapolated that, counting how many squares the whole bundle would occupy. So it was a challenge, but I felt like my solution was kind of the best approach to quantifying these bundles with such immense quantities.
One of the challenges around the research, I think, is that it affects and has been found in so many areas, whether that is, in the ocean, being found in sort of smaller organisms, and we know that the ocean is one of the biggest sequesters of carbon in the world. So the fact that there's plastic in the ocean and small fibers in the ocean that are being eaten as a food stock that has no nutritious value, that has a negative impact on the environment. And I've seen different research and articles around microplastics being found in cloud formations and changing the temperature at which like ice is formed, and then meaning that you end up with different levels of rainfall and larger rainfall events. So it's even pervading our weather. It's in our brains. It's in organisms in the ocean. That's one of the challenges, I think, though, is that it's everywhere, and there's only so many researchers in the world like yourself, Liberty, that can actually get stuck into doing detailed analysis of what the impact of that is. But we're finding more and more all the time. It can be very challenging sometimes to be immersed in that world where you see the different issues that this is creating. But I think that we try and live in a place where we're hopeful about it as well, and we know that when our backs are against the wall, humans are very versatile, and we can get a lot of stuff done in a very short amount of time when we really put our minds to it. And with that in mind, maybe it's a good time to talk about sort of policy and potential solutions, because earlier on you talked a little bit about sort of concerns around how wastewater is treated for microplastics and microfibers, and the fact that these fibers are ending up in basins like Medina River Estuary. What changes or improvements do you think that companies and regulators could focus on to address the issue of microplastics and microfibers?
Yeah, of course. So I think to start with, I think it's widely understood now that the sewage system that we have is inadequate to support this volume of flow that's entering it in the first place. So I think the priority is that we need to focus on improving urban drainage and slowing that flow of water entering the system. The way our sewage system works is that there's the two are combined. So the wastewater is combined with this kind of blue water running off these impermeable urban surfaces, and then it's all going into our sewage system. And that's why our CSOs are activated so much, is just because of this immense kind of volume of flow that's entering the system in the first place. So it's kind of simple in that sense, is that the way that we can reduce the frequency of these CSOs being activated is by actually reducing this volume of flow entering the system. And I think there's some really exciting kind of innovative solutions here. So I've recently been kind of educating myself about the use of SUDs, so sustainable drainage systems. And these are really cool. I'm a big fan of these. They're really great. Not only do they have these benefits in terms of kind of environmental benefits, providing kind of habitats, and kind of aesthetic benefits too, but they're a really great kind of solution to slowing this flow and improving this urban drainage in our systems, to prevent it entering the wastewater system. So I think that there's further progress to be made here. It's kind of all just started, so I think there's a really great journey to go on here with implementing these SUDs in our towns and cities, to kind of improve that urban drainage.
Yeah, and I'm also biased on this topic, Liberty. I think I said to you in one of our first interactions, my partner works in nature-based SUD schemes and designs. And so, yeah, when we're talking about water infrastructure in the UK, I think that's a really, really important and nature-based as well way of dealing with the challenges. So you talked a little bit about what companies can do and what regulators can do. What about the general public? Like what's the general public's role in reducing microfibers and reducing microplastics that end up in the environment? What's your view on that?
Well, just firstly to go back to SUDs, I can't stop talking about them. But just in terms of kind of the public, the public's kind of relation to that, I think that water companies should focus on implementing these. But as the public, we also have a role to play. So, in our everyday kind of choices in terms of these solutions. So, for example, if you're getting your driveway redone, like look at these kind of permeable options. Installing water butts in your garden. I think we probably, a lot of us already do it, but we don't realise that we're already kind of that is a solution to these to kind of reducing the frequency of these CSOs. So continue to do that, continue to kind of factor SUDs into our everyday kind of decisions and choices that we're making, just as individuals and as the general public. We kind of have a say in that as well. But off the topic of SUDs, coming back to microfibers in general, not just in looking at the wastewater system. So I think the first step is awareness and education. I think that we need to kind of make ourselves aware about the sources of microfibers into the environment. I actually personally was unaware about how big of a source laundering was for microfibers before I started my research. I knew it was a contributor, but I didn't know it was that significant. So I think it's really important that we ourselves take time to educate and find out and be curious and inquisitive about these sources of microfibers into the aquatic environment. We have an access to a huge range of sustainable clothing brands now, which is really, really exciting. And we didn't a few years ago. So I think we should take advantage of that. Look at the wonderful work they're doing and the amazing products they're creating, and actually choose them over your kind of traditional textile clothing brands that you'd usually opt for. There's lots of choices that we can make, but I believe that they must be fueled by our own knowledge and awareness. We have to have kind of a drive behind the choices, and if someone asks you why you're doing it, you should be able to talk about it with kind of passion and knowledge as well. And so I think it all just starts with education and awareness at an individual level, before going ahead and making those choices.
Yeah, and I think something you mentioned there, like, is a really good starting point for everyone, is just having that curiosity. Like, a lot of people would not have thought about where does their clothing come from, what's the impact of their clothing once they bought it. Like, we hear about how much water the industry uses. I work with a lot of factories in different geographies around the world that are using billions of liters of water, and it's really big numbers. It's really, really impactful, the textile industry, on the quality of water out there, whether that's in the UK or in Asia or Central America, wherever. Like, it's really big impact. Having that curiosity to go out there and do a bit of research and educate yourself is really, really important. What about from like a policy perspective, from a government and regulatory perspective? What do you think can be done there? What needs to happen at that level?
So I strongly believe that we should be routinely monitoring microplastics in the environment, which we're currently not doing. So regulators are currently not monitoring microplastics routinely across various water bodies. I think this is really important because we need to understand the scope of this issue, and we currently don't because we don't have the data. So I believe that this monitoring is vital and needs to be done and implemented at a regulatory level. Additionally, as well, monitoring wastewater treatment facilities, I think that should be mandatory, and again, this will help increase transparency. So regulators should require reports of these microplastics, like the levels of microplastics at these wastewater treatment facilities, and at that point where wastewater is discharged into the aquatic environment, we should have data available of the level of microplastics entering the aquatic environment at that point source. Something that I actually found when I was doing my research is that there's currently no standardized method for sampling microplastics in the environment. So it did take me a while to kind of review a variety of methods and other literature, and I had to kind of evaluate the most appropriate and effective for my research. But I strongly believe that there should be a standardized protocol for sampling microplastics as well across various water bodies, so that we have data that we can compare and contrast, and just to ensure that consistency. So my research, I took that measurement of items per kilogram of dry weight sediment, but there's a variety already of kind of those different measures that are used for microplastics. I also think that governments should introduce regulations earlier on in that chain that we were talking about earlier. So installing filters on washing machines, for example. I think that this should be mandatory and something that we should prioritize, because I know it's being talked about, but something that's not for many years, but this should be a priority. This should be something that is regulated and introduced into policy in the next year. I'm aware from my research that microfibers are prevalent across our natural systems, and this must be stopped. This needs to be prioritized now.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking our language. You're talking about microfiber filtration in laundering. That's where matter started, and we're really encouraged to see that it's something that's being discussed. It is being talked about, but so far no one's taken the plunge on making that microfiber filtration being integrated into a washing machine. No one's made that a requirement yet, but we cross our fingers and hope that will happen. And our team at Matter are doing a lot of work with politicians and with different bodies to help that to happen as well. And I think that the data you're talking about collecting from wastewater treatment plants, again, that could be really it creates a baseline. It creates a data pool that we can start to work with. Like in sustainability, the whole time that I've worked in this sustainability space, there's the saying, you can't reduce what you can't measure. Like you have to start with a number so that you can reduce it. If you don't know what the start point is, then how do you know that anything you're doing is working? So data is really important. But again, I know that there are people in the industry that feel that it can be very easy to hide behind that as well and say, we don't know what the numbers are, we don't know what the testing method's going to be, so therefore we'll wait and find out, and it delays things. And so it's a very difficult one to navigate, but I agree with you. I think all of these things need to happen, and they need to happen soon, because this microplastic and microfiber pollution issue is only getting worse every day, but every year that we leave it, from a regulatory perspective. So, as a researcher on this topic, what are your thoughts on how the industry can collaborate to better understand the problem, to address the issue of microplastic pollution? You talked about reporting already. Is there anything else that you think you'd add into that at all?
I just think that we should continue to collaborate, and even more than we are. It's a really powerful approach to kind of combine our collective knowledge and resources, and we should continue to do it in the water industry. So bringing in these NGOs and governments and companies, water companies, the public. We should continue to do that. Research institutions as well, academic institutions. But it's a really valuable way to kind of combine our collective knowledge and and define solutions as a whole. And I think we should continue to do that. Additionally, I think that I'm actually really passionate about increasing transparency in the water industry. Going back to what I said about there's a lack of public trust. The only way to overcome that is by increasing transparency. I think the public are angry about the lack of transparency. The lack of available data. Data is not made accessible. So from one end, water companies should be making that data accessible, and engaging with the public. But also, as individuals, we should be prioritizing, educating ourselves, and staying curious and being inquisitive to better understand what's already being done. And I think if these two things are done from different kind of perspectives, we'll have a more transparent water industry, which is something that we do really need to overcome these challenges that we're facing.
A lot of the companies I talk to, like brands and textiles producers, they're saying the same words, like, how do we collaborate more? How do we share more insight? If we all go on this journey together, it has a lot more momentum and it has a much bigger impact than, if one water company decides to do this, or one brand or one textiles producer decides to really tackle this issue. That's great, but you can move at a much greater pace and you can have a much bigger impact if you take the whole industry along with you as well. So there's a lot that can be said for that collaboration, I think. So with the water companies and the kind of evolution of the industry, when it comes to the impact and the responsibility that they can have in terms of minimizing microplastic pollution, what do you see their role as, maybe outside of just being collaborators?
I think that currently the focus is on compliance. So it's all about meeting these regulatory standards. But actually the focus should be on kind of leadership, and kind of championing their responsibility here. So, water companies in the water industry should be leaders, and they should be proactive and confident and actually lead the way and kind of inspire others to do the same. They're at the forefront of driving this kind of innovation and solutions to challenges, and they should be confident and proactive in their approach to that. I believe that also it's important there to see the long-term benefits. So companies in the water industry are able to actually see this kind of longer-term timescale with regards to solutions they are considering kind of implementing, and they should just be confident in kind of collaborating and working with others to implement these solutions, to reduce microplastic levels in the environment. So yeah, I just think there needs to be a shift really from this current compliance state that we're in to more of a proactive leadership approach. And I think if that happens, that will also inspire other companies in various industries to do the same. And I also think that will encourage that restoration of trust in the water industry from the public, if we can see companies kind of leading the way and being confident in the approaches that they're taking.
Awesome. So what I'm hearing there is move away from just being compliant and doing, for lack of better words, the bare minimum to be legally compliant. Kind of picking up the issue of not just microplastics, but other sustainability issues as well, and really becoming proactive and being champions on that, and just being really confident in their approach that this is the right thing to do. So, tackling microplastic and microfiber pollution is the right thing to do, and that it requires a long-term view as well. This isn't, as with a lot of projects in the water industry, they're not short-term investment, short-term wins. It's a long-term view. Nobody doesn't want us to have a secure water network in the next 15 years. It's something that we're always going to need. So that long-term view is really essential. So what about looking forward? What are the next steps to support cleaning up the water and the environment, and maybe some of the work that you've done or you're going to be doing in the future? That'd be really interesting to hear your views.
Yeah, of course. So I have always been a big beach cleaner. I've loved that growing up on the Isle of Wight. the beaches around here are just so beautiful, and I've always loved having the opportunity to actually go out there um and see that beauty, but also kind of see that other side of the kind of volume of litter polluting them, and be proactive and clean that up. So I still am part of a really fantastic beach cleaning group called Planet Aware. So I've kind of taken more of a role in that now, where I organise beach cleans on the Isle of Wight, which is something I absolutely love doing, because just kind of bringing people together. Um, it has lots of benefits, not just for the environment, but also for us as well, to get outside, get some fresh air, and do something good. And I actually worked previously for the Marine Conservation Society as their Great British Beach Clean Administrator. So that's the citizen science initiative, which happens every year at the end of September, to coincide with the International Coastal Cleanup. And I just think that citizen science is such a wonderful thing. So the focus of the Great British Beach Clean, and the beach cleans that they encourage people to do, is not just about picking up litter, but also about recording the types of items they're finding, so that we can get this really valuable data pool through litter surveys. So I always have that as a priority when I'm organising my beach cleans. Is actually, it's fantastic to be collecting and removing this litter from the beach, but it's also even better to understand the items that are on our beaches, to inform decisions. So the Marine Conservation Society actually collect in all that data that's submitted to them, and then use it to kind of drive their policies, and their what they stand for. So it's a really valuable resource to have that litter survey data. I will always kind of try and keep participating in as much citizen science as I can. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think I encourage everyone to get involved with things like that. If it's not beach cleaning and recording items on the beach, you can do it on your local river, or even a park. What items start there, which will eventually end up in our rivers and oceans. So anyone can get involved. I strongly encourage that. I think it's a really great thing to do. But in terms of my next step, so I'm going to be joining RPS group at the end of this month, January, which I'm really excited about. So I'm going to be a wastewater catchment modeler. So I'll be basically supporting companies as a consultant in defining solutions. So I'm really excited to, again, just kind of take forward my passion for improving our waterways into my career, into this kind of next step into in my career.
That's awesome. There's so many different things you're involved in, and yeah, congrats on the RPS move as well. I think
Thank you.
it'll be really cool. When you were talking just then about the citizen science, I think it was called.
Yes.
Um, did you have any like insight into maybe decisions or like policies that have been influenced or created off the back of that kind of like litter data that's been collected by citizen science?
Yeah, well, I think the Marine Conservation Society are brilliant at this. They make it a priority to make that data that's submitted to them accessible, in terms of like these larger reports that they then submit to governments, to kind of increase this regulation and target new policies. So it's really great that they make that so accessible, so you can kind of follow the journey from you're standing at the beach in the cold ticking litter items on a survey, to then actually seeing that journey, that data gets collated, and the kind of data analysts are then able to kind of track the top polluting items on beaches, and then take that data and information forward. So I think it's a really powerful and exciting journey that it starts with individuals, and then you can see the influence you're having just by taking part in one litter survey, that then going on and being used to inform decisions. So yeah, I just think it's really powerful and inspiring to be a part of that, as an individual participating in kind of a citizen science initiative.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think the fact that you've got that open source data, that if you're a policymaker or a regulator, like having actual data and knowing where to focus and what the biggest like problem items are, like it just helps you have that laser focused vision, doesn't it, and make better decisions. So we covered loads of interesting stuff today, and your research has been the kind of catalyst for this conversation and us talking. What are the three key points that you want to leave anyone who's looking at this content or thinking about microfiber, microplastic pollution, and what they might be able to do?
Okay, so I think number one is to educate yourself and stay inquisitive and curious. Keep challenging ideas that get kind of suggested to you, but take it upon yourself to educate yourself about what's already happening, and understand your local aquatic environment. So there's some great apps like there, like the Safer Seas and Rivers service by Surfers Against Sewage. That's a really great resource to actually understand the kind of level of pollution in your local waterways. So yeah, just take it upon yourself to understand and be aware of your local aquatic environment. Number two, I think continue to make sustainable choices. Factor that into as many decisions in your everyday lifestyle as you can. But I think specifically from this conversation, we focused on clothing. And like I said before, there's a brilliant variety of sustainable clothing brands now. So, sit down one evening and have a browse, take advantage of those, and opt for those more sustainable clothing choices in your life. And then thirdly, I'd just say be an advocate for cleaner waterways. Water is such a valuable resource. It needs to be clean. So kind of adopt that mindset, and be confident in your what you value, and speak to others about it. Be present, so get involved as much as you can. Whether that's things like, for example, the March for Clean Water, that was a fantastic kind of active march that happened, but also being present in terms of like citizen science as much as you can, getting out there. We need something to fuel our choices. So being present, getting out there, and being an advocate for cleaner waterways, and then we can kind of use that passion to drive our decisions that we make in our everyday lives.
Yeah, all three of those are great. And maybe I'd add a fourth one onto that actually, just like believe in the impact that you can have as a person, because
Yes.
so many people that I've spoken to in sustainability and more recently in like clean water, even if they work at a company that uses a lot of water and involved in the making process around how to clean that up, like don't don't necessarily believe in the impact that they as an individual can have. So whether you're thinking about buying clothes or whether you're thinking about a new project at work to clean up a water source or to invest in a nature-based sud scheme or whatever it is that you're thinking about, like just the fact that you're thinking about it and trying to do something can help. Not everything's going to be successful, but if we all do something, that confidence to go and do something is really important as well. So thank you, Liberty. Really good.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.